You mentioned earlier the three turnings.
Yes.
And so that one of the things that Ken is pointing out in this project, and he's not the only one, but where he starts is sort of in this historical context of saying Buddhism actually has been through three evolutions. So before we get to whether we're in the middle of a fourth, you kind of look back, as opposed to Christianity, which went sort of a different route, and say, well, there actually have been three distinctly different, translations and practices this thing has moved forward. So in your own, not in Ken's, sort of sort out of all that, because everybody has a little bit different way of doing it. Mm-hmm. That idea made sense to you, obviously. I mean, when someone says the three turnings, you go, all right, so I get that. I know what it is. But can you just briefly kind of walk us through what your translation of what those three turnings would be?
Yeah. I mean, it's a wonderful way of classifying, this vast outpouring of the Buddhist tradition. There are a number of different kind of classification schemas. And the three turnings is really one of the most compelling. And as you suggest, and this is so inspiring really, that Buddhism does evolve. The first turning teachings were really primarily about, you could say, individual liberation, kind of the dissecting of reality, taking reality apart, starting to see what the fundamental causes of suffering are. This is obviously put forth by the historical Buddha. And then the second turning came along, really with Nagarjuna, sometimes referred to as the second Buddha. And really, many people may not realize that these were original innovative teachings. This was a body of truth that the Buddha didn't, he intimated it, of course, with things like the Prajnaparamita Sutras and whatnot. But Nagarjuna came along, this extraordinary genius from India, and he put forth an entirely new way of looking at reality, which became embodied, of course, in the very sophisticated teachings of the Madhyamaka. A way to, you could say, to take the parts that the first turning had reduced reality, kind of dissected what Alfred North Whitehead referred to as the fallacy of not only misplaced concreteness, but the fallacy of concreteness altogether. So the first turning, took that concreteness and broke it apart. But yet it reified those parts. It said, the parts are real. Second turning, Nagarjuna comes along and says, well, the parts aren't even real. And that's why, the Heart Sutra, which is the principal depiction of the second turning, that's why sometimes it's referred to as the Heart Attack Sutra, because now even the parts don't exist. And that was shocking. They say in the tradition, of course, archetypally, that 500 of the senior-most students had heart attacks when this truth was put forth. So this was innovative. It was original teaching, but yet there was still another step to go, because if you're just cutting, which really both the first and the second turning are all about, what's left? Is it just a nihilistic void? Are we just cutting the world into shreds, where there's nothing at all? There's a big difference between nothingness and no-thingness. Mm-hmm. Nothingness is nihilistic. No-thingness is another synonym for egolessness. This is just a more accurate way to look at the world. So after Nagarjuna took the world apart, then principally the brothers Asanga and Vasubandhu, half-brothers, then started to describe what's left. What can we talk about? What is it that we can really start to speak with some authority that we no longer then reify? So of course then the third turning came about. And the third turning is, sometimes referred to as the teachings on luminosity. The second turnings are sometimes referred to as the teachings on emptiness.
So then the third turning, what is its nature? I mean, why do we keep pushing? Why did the faith and everybody involved in it keep pushing to this next level?
Yeah, it's because we have to, or I should say, it's helpful to say something about something. Mm-hmm. If we're constantly just cutting, it can get pretty cold and clinical and really not particularly inspiring. So the third turning's teachings came about as a way to proclaim the radiance of emptiness, the shine of emptiness. So it returned into the world of form, and it said, let's talk about this form appropriately. Let's talk about the shine of the mind. The first, and in particular the second turning, the emphasis is principally on emptiness. Emptiness, neti, not this, not that. And it's sometimes referred to, Ponlop Rinpoche, one of my teachers, talked about it as the extreme path to the middle. The extreme path to the middle, meaning we're so much embedded in a view of reification, of thingness, that we really have to go to the extreme of the second turning where everything is really just shredded, cutting, so that we can find our way back to the middle, reality, somewhere in the middle. So this then becomes the via positiva, the assertion of what's left. What can we actually talk about that's in the middle? And the reason you can do it is because now you can talk with authority without reifying that which you're talking about. So they're called luminosity teachings because you're really talking about the expression of that emptiness, the shine of reality, the shine of your own mind. And that luminosity fundamentally is really everything that we experience as the world of form. In the Vajrayana teachings, luminosity is a way to talk about what form is. So then, Vasubandhu and the Yogacara teachings are about how do we describe the display of this form? How can we pay homage to it? How can we celebrate it? How can we, take, using the analogy of the second turning, you take a car apart, you dissect it into its component parts. Well, the Yogacara, the third turning teachings say then, yes, let's get in this car and go for a joyride. Let's celebrate what's left. Let's talk about the shine of the mind. Let's talk about the radiance, the healthy expression of that mind. So that's the genius of the third turning teachings. And then, of course, I completely believe that there's room for a fourth turning and even beyond. Because once you return to the world of form with an accurate lens of what that form is and how it can play out and evolve, then we can talk, as Ken is suggesting here, we can talk with real elegance and power about the evolution of that form. Because we need to remember that when Vasubandhu and the Sangha were putting forth the third turning teachings, it's almost unbelievable for us to look back and realize they didn't know about evolution. Darwin had not yet come along. So, we take it now as axiomatic, it's just a given that evolution is just the nature of things. They didn't know that back then. So now, why not take this vast arsenal of Western intellectual knowledge and bring it to supplement and augment and really talk about the evolution of the form that the third turning actually started to put forth in a really authentic way. How does this form continue to evolve? And that's what's so exciting about what Ken is doing. He's talking about just that. How do we work with the shine, the form of mind and reality as a way to really help us wake up to that.
Mm-hmm. So I know that you are involved or have been involved with conversations with the teachers and authors and Buddhist leaders about this notion of sort of what I call the now and the future of Buddhism. Mm-hmm. Now, that's happening across all traditions. Buddhism is no exception in a certain sense. Here we are in the 21st century, and all of us that are paying any attention, you feel the rush of change. And we keep saying things like everything's changing quicker and quicker, and when you actually look at certain timelines in almost any field that you look at, you just say there's an extraordinary amount of change taking place. And this also includes this whole notion of where does spiritual practice fit in all of that. So Buddhists are no exceptions in this of sort of looking for the relevance in the 21st century of this beautiful traditional teachings that has benefited so many people in the world. So when you're having those discussions now, what's sort of on the list of things, not that it needs to be included, but you're saying, like you just said, well, we've evolved. And Ken will make this point of, over the last 1,500 years, lots happened, right? And so what does Buddhism look like that includes all of that? But what are some of the subjects that you and this group have been talking about what needs to be considered, not even be concluded, but what needs to be considered? Oh
my gosh, I mean, it has to do, of course, with maintaining the integrity of this tradition as it's being transplanted and adapted into this culture. It has to do with the great contributions of science, and how it is that science is really getting its mitts on meditation. And because of the near conflation of meditation with Buddhism, how it is that the Buddhist tradition is really kind of riding in on the coattails of all this great scientific this exploration. So, what is the relationship of science here? What can science contribute without Buddhism falling prey to scientism, the near enemy of the gift of science? And then, psychology, the great contributions of the psychological tradition, and yet how do we maintain the integrity of these disciplines in their respective domains? How do they cross-pollinate without cross-polluting? How do they substantiate and help each other, bootstrap each other without taking each other down? The relevance of meditation in Buddhism to really relationships, to business, to society. I'm a student of Shambhala Buddhism, and one of the great contributions of Shambhala Buddhism is its tremendous emphasis on enlightened society and culture. How it is that we can now bring this wisdom tradition to work with the world at large. So it's not just what we do phenomenologically, it's not just what we do in the interior. How do we, again, it's the expression of how do we shine properly? So really, to me, it's such an exciting time. There are so many promises, there's so much potential, but as you well know, there's also a concomitant peril. When there are lots of near enemies, there are lots of places where the tradition can stray. So these are just a few of it: the relationship of mindfulness to Buddhism, science, psychology, relationships.
Right. Well, there's one. How about the student-teacher relationship? Is that in a certain way that's not going to disappear? Because obviously this is part of the tradition that a teacher brings a student along into a certain level of awareness and can be so helpful along the way of doing that. But we also see some of the failures and some of the dysfunction that's going on in spiritual communities, and people get disheartened because this teacher that they so dearly love suddenly starts acting out in other ways in the world that don't seem to make sense with someone that has sort of an enlightened state. And of course, the Integral has a whole way of mapping this out that you can sort of say, well, what's really going on here?
Yeah.
But what about that? Is that subject in a certain sense of what is the relationship to the teacher, to the Sangha, to the student? Is that all?
It's a very hot topic. It's a very hot topic, really. And as you alluded to, it's one of the things that I find so brilliant with the Integral model. It's one of the very few frameworks that can explain really otherwise the inexplicable.
Yes.
I mean, how do you take someone who's really a pretty awakened, enlightened being? How do you explain some of these really bizarre, irrational behaviors? So it's a big topic in the West, and especially when you get to, in the Buddhist tradition, there's kind of a tripartite or evolutionary relationship to the teacher. At entry levels, you can almost say first turning levels, it's more like a spiritual friend. The teacher is just someone that you're establishing a relationship to that knows a little bit more, that has just a few steps ahead of you. And as that relationship matures, using the analogy of a romance, for instance, you're no longer just dating. You're starting to become more committed. So that the second degree of relationship would be the spiritual elder, the Kalyana Mitra. Someone who you can turn to now that has a little bit more authority, someone that you're willing to actually surrender or start to surrender to. Then, of course, then the final stage is the most provocative one and also the most dangerous one, and that's the stage associated with the Vajrayana teachers, or I should say Vajrayana level. And this, of course, is the full-blown guru-disciple relationship. This is a real hornet's nest in the West, because you run into extraordinarily slippery topics like surrender and devotion, faith, idiot faith versus tested faith, surrender to a higher power versus surrender to some kind of projected quality of your own neurosis. So it's a very hot topic, and it's a really charged one now in the West because there are a lot of really qualified teachers with fully sanctioned training that can guide people in a very legitimate way. But because of the profitability, as Buddhism becomes more a commodity in the West, people are starting to come in that are truly charlatans. And if they don't have lineage backing, if they don't have traditional sanctioning, if they're not training, they can certainly do more harm than good. And you just have to open your eyes to see that not only the Buddhist tradition, but every world tradition is replete with this kind of problem. So it's a big issue, how to surrender properly, how to really work with this incredibly powerful notion of devotion, which is the central ingredient in Vajrayana Buddhism altogether. How do we do that skillfully? So this is a really big topic that, again, if we're simply aware of how we can go astray here, the places that we can get lost, at least we can be informed, or at least better informed in terms of selecting a teacher, choosing someone that has as close as you can get to some guarantee of authenticity and legitimacy. So very much on the table.
Yeah. And this is what excites us about this conversation, is that it, just to address it, to jump into these things and to say, how does it integrate? How does it, because as Ken said, if, in any of these spiritual traditions, and we've seen this historically, if it doesn't, then there's another issue, is that it starts to become less relevant. People move away from it.
Yeah,
you lose all
exactly.
the great gifts that it's brought. So it needs to update itself, and certainly Buddhism seems to be up for it. It'll be interesting to see how this all...
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it's an open question. This is such a pregnant time in the West. It's full of tremendous potential. And, because of that power, there's also the concomitant peril. And really the best thing we can do, I believe, is advocates and practitioners, and is to be as informed as we possibly can. Where do these shadow elements arise? How can we use them to really help us or prevent us from falling into these traps that can be extraordinarily damaging? What kind of maps do we have at our disposal that help us walk this territory with some intelligence and sensitivity?
Thank you so much for sharing.
It's been my pleasure, David. Thank you so much for your time.